too. So welcome to those of us joining from around the world, if I can channel my inner Nicholas Parsons. So I'm really pleased we've got today's speakers. I met one of them at the Imperial War Museum's conference last year, and we got to talking about his research, and I was really impressed with the detail and meticulous nature of the work involved. I'm going to allow our speakers to introduce themselves because I'm not mic'd up, but for those of you who are in, give a very warm welcome to today's speakers.
Thank you. Our talk today is, of course, the archaeology of the V weapons. I'd just like to start with a little reminder that the V weapons were indiscriminate weapons of destruction. They killed people in the countries that were targeted. Countermeasures against them caused losses to the attacking aircrew, those on the ground below. And the manufacture of the weapons cost many human lives, often in appalling conditions. During a visit to Nordhausen and a tour of Mittelbau, which is of course where the V1 and V2 were assembled, I asked the guide in my best German why the many parts of V1 littering the tunnel floors and rusting away were not retrieved and conserved. Come in, you're not too late. Thanks. And he replied in perfect English, "This is a memorial to those who worked and died in these tunnels, not a museum to the ingenuity of the Third Reich." And with that thought, we'll start our lecture. So the very first thing I'd like to do is just to define archaeology. It's the study of history through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artefacts and other physical remains. And although many have been involved in the recovery of artefacts from modern conflict, few have analysed their finds, their context, and documented this to add to the historical record. All too often, the trophies from digging appear on the internet auction sites, adding absolutely nothing to history. Conservation, analysis, documentation, and dissemination are fundamentals of what we do. And the honour of presenting here today helps us to achieve this.
Right. Brief introduction. I'm Colin Welch. This is my brother Sean. We've been studying the V weapons for around 10 years now. We're going to try very hard to give you a clear overview about what we've been doing. It's a massive subject, intensely interesting. We've been completely immersed in it for all of that time. We found out some truly incredible things. We won an award for our work for a particular V2 rocket study, and we've had a great deal of success in terms of the media. We're going to get cracking away now, and we're going to go straight into the V1 flying bomb. Well, the V1 flying bomb was ramp launched, and you've got a modular launch ramp there at Duxford. That means that it was assembled on site very quickly. That was because we had discovered where most of the sites were, where they were concrete launch ramps. The V1 travelled somewhere about 400 miles an hour top speed, 400 to 500 it could go, but it meant that coming the 120 miles from the Pas de Calais to London, it would take something like 20 minutes.
Right, this is a typical V1 impact site. You can see it here in the middle of the picture. The Allied intelligence were quite keen on documenting crater sizes, and those records exist. They've produced some very nice charts. So the average crater size for a V1 was 20 feet in diameter, which for those of you who've been metricated, that's 6 metres, and just 5 feet deep, which is 1.5 metres deep.
Typically, we find, when we're evaluating a site, we find a lot of rusty rubbish that looks like that, curly bits of steel encrusted in rust. We also, in the early stages, found in woodland what we thought were the little wedges that you put in the head of a hammer to hold the hammer in. But after some obvious research, we found they were not that at all.
Yeah, the pieces that look like hammer wedges, they're actually the input grill for the Argus pulse jet engine. And you can see a representative diagram here. And the pieces that we were finding were these bits here. and they're shaped like an arrowhead. Alongside of them, there were little spring steels. The principle of operation was the petrol, the fuel mixture, was atomised through these atomisers here, and then to start the cycle there was a spark plug that detonated the petrol and air mix, and then once the cycle had started it was self-sustaining, and these little spring steels, as the explosion occurred in the combustion chamber, it actually shut them so that the blast was directed out back of the tube. And then, once that blast had dispersed, the air rushing towards the grill opened these spring steels again to let in the less that sort of petrol-laden fuel.
So you're looking at about 50 cycles a second, which gave it a characteristic two-stroke, badly tuned engine sound, so it chugged through the air. The matrix was not the only thing that we found. This is the most extraordinary find. It's actually the whole jet unit from a V1 flying bomb.
Quite a weighty object. They weighed somewhere in the region of 150 kilos, but you can imagine with the thing chock full of clay, it was a lot heavier than that. We had great fun winching that into the back of the trailer to take it home to clean it.
In terms of archaeology, this told us an awful lot because there was a very beautiful story around the artefact.
This is actually the combat report for the shooting down of that particular V1. And it's interesting, this one was submitted by Donachik, but he says that just as he was about to fire, Tempest fired from 700 yards, and he was in the Tempest and he fired from 700 yards as a Mustang ahead, fired from 300 yards line astern, and the jet blew up. They both had a half claim, and when we were cleaning the pulse jet engine, we found some remarkable finds.
So if you can picture the fact that the Mustang could not keep up easily with the flying bomb, its standard tactic was to be patrolling at height, be vectored onto the flying bomb by radar. It would dive down to gather speed. So that's one thing. That's Flight Sergeant Donachik of 315 Squadron. Meanwhile, we've got an unidentified Tempest pilot who swoops in because the Tempest can keep up with a flying bomb, and it was one of the primary machines used to shoot the things down. So the Tempest pilot, we believe, came in from one side of the jet unit and slightly below. Now, the Hawker Tempest was firing 20mm cannon shell. This hole in the side of the jet unit is a 20mm cannon puncture. So my brother and I were discussing this after having cleaned up the jet unit, and we came to the conclusion that the Tempest pilot actually had been successful and Donachik hadn't. That was until I found the front grille surround of the jet unit.
Here, we've got some more holes, and the size of those holes correspond exactly with a half-inch.
Which is what the Mustang was firing.
So the two aircraft both had different armament aboard. One had the 20mm, the other one had the half-inch. So it actually corroborates the combat report. Both pilots actually had a part in bringing down this particular flying bomb. Donachik is somebody who we've followed. We've been fortunate enough to be able to trace 3 of his V1s. And each one of them had a fascinating story to tell. He was Polish, but unfortunately he was shot down later in the war while he was attacking V2 supplies in the north of Germany, and he was killed, unfortunately.
So the next story, a truly remarkable thing. We knew that there was a flying bomb that had made an impact in some woodland. It was a triple SI, truly well protected by Natural England. They kindly gave us permission, along with the Woodland Trust. The trouble was the archive research for the site pointed, because of a clerical error we now know, to the site actually being 12 miles away, north of a town rather than 6 miles south. So the thing that corroborated everything was this incredible bit of footage. It's very short, but you need to concentrate. Most of these footage of attacks on flying bombs just appear as the first section. Hardly ever do you get the pilot actually filming at the end the detonation on the ground. So watch carefully. Hello? We've got a misfire. Technology. Right, that was it. We're going to do that again, I think. Can we do that again? Let's go to it. So what we're looking at is that final frame. At this moment, the Mustang is shooting at it. So what we have is that right at the end.
So what we were able to do was, using our friend Google Earth and the unique feature that it has, that you can look back in time, was to be able to look at the field patterns here and the woodland, and to match that up exactly with an image that we had on Google Earth. And here you can actually see the impact site in the wood. You can see where the trees have been blasted away. You can see that was the long wood that was marked.
Sorry, can I? Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt. I'm really sorry. Your microphone's failed. So I'm going to have to ask you if you can walk to this side of the stage. We'll balance it out.
Okay, fine.
It's one of many technical problems.
So for planet Earth, we've got a little technical problem we're just trying to deal with. Well, this site produced some of the most amazing artifacts that we've found. Yes, that doesn't look particularly amazing at the moment, but after a year of conservation, what we have is that. It's the complete control, gyro control tray from the back of a flying bomb. This flying bomb that you just saw shot down in the footage.
It's actually still got evidence of the strikes. You can see in the gyro here, it's a little bit knocked out.
Further right.
There.
Yeah.
That's a better view of it. So here's the back plate of the gyro. You can see where the splinters come through.
That would have been enough to destabilise the flying bomb.
We think this gyro was actually knocked off with its mounting. So of course that would have put it into a dive. And it's interesting that the V1 impacts in Kent, where the doodlebugs were shot down, they've actually gone vertically down into the ground. Whereas the ones that are further up towards London, they've actually gone through the sequence where the airlock has shut off the fuel supply, they've gone into a shallow dive, they've hit the ground at a shallow angle and detonated. That means that all the bits and pieces are blasted out of the crater. So we're quite fortunate looking at the ones that we've looked at in finding parts, just by virtue of the fact that they dive vertically into the ground.
More about the airlog in a moment. Part of our remit is to try to record everything as accurately as possible so that people in the future can have access to what we've done and perhaps come to different conclusions. So this is the same V1 flying bomb impact site, giving the locations of all of the finds. There's an analysis of the existing crater up there that I had a go at trying to put into 3 dimensions on the right-hand side. And as technology is improving, gradually we're beginning to be able to achieve our dream of being able to actually take a site and move it around in 3 dimensions on a computer. So, the air log. Would you like to explain that one, Sean?
Yeah, right at the very nose of the V1 was a little propeller. And most people think that the V1 ran out of fuel. When it ran out of fuel, then dived down into the ground. It isn't quite true. The technology was this little propeller, as it moved through the air, it rotated, it was on a spindle, and it went back to an odometer. And that could be set, could be preset. When it reached the preset, there was a sequence of events. It fired a series of detonators, and it severed the air lines to the rudder and the elevators. And it also dropped a couple of air brakes. The intention was that the V1 would actually dive under power to the target. But of course, with a nearly empty fuel tank by the time it arrived at its target, which was mostly London, what happened was there was a fuel surge. And so what people heard was the engine cutting out. But by the time the engine had cut out, the V1 was already in a dive. And it's interesting because the dive wasn't in the line of travel. The 2 little air brakes at the back were of different sizes, so it actually skewed it round to one side. But people were quite right that, you know, if you hear it stop, take cover.
This is from a different site. This particular part of the flying bomb, it's from the yoke that actually supported the front of the jet unit. On the coast in Kent and into Sussex, all of the anti-aircraft guns had been assembled. After, in the early stages, they were assembled nearer London. They moved them down to the coast, and as this has travelled over the coast, it's picked up a bit of anti-aircraft shell splinter. However, this was finally shot down, this one, different site.
Some of the other finds, some of the ways that we can identify and put into our reports. This small fragment here, you can see how it fits into the gyroscope. It's actually the air feed. The gyroscope, I'm sure that many of you had a gyroscope when you were young as a toy. You pulled the string, the disc spun round and round, and you could destabilise the mount, but the gyroscope would always stay in the same position. Same principle here. Inside of here there's a brass with little channels in, compressed air from 2 big spherical compressed air bottles was fed in to make this gyroscope spin round and round. And there were little sensors that could sense if the V1 moved in any direction. So up, down, laterally, and little adjustments could be made with some actuators on the rudder or on the elevators. This particular bit here is part of the fuel supply. The fuel, 670 litres of low-grade petrol, and it was supplied to the engine, again using the motive power from the compressed air bottles.
Finally, this unit here is part of the launch fixing underneath the flying bomb. There's a lovely example here in the museum that's worth going and have a look at, because you can see this underneath. There was a paddle on the launch ramp that fitted into that and shot the thing off the end of the launch ramp. What's interesting is that you've got some numbers on this one, and this little thing here across that we think is a centre of balance. Before the thing was launched, the Nazi Germans took the thing into an anti-magnetic building and hit it with mallets to try to condition the compass, so that it would actually fly to the target straight. But it needed a centre of balance.
Also, what we've become quite adept in is using the GPS tool and mapping out a blast field. So the impact point is here, and you can see here where we've actually plotted out and overlaid. Again, we can use this in reports.
Yeah, a nice tool, the GPS tool. We've also tried to embed modern technology further, so we've got photographs from the site that we're actually fixing to those GPS positions. So at a later date, we can go back and we can see exactly what we were looking at the moment we were studying the site. The countermeasures.
So we had a line of anti-aircraft guns along the coast, and fighter aircraft would fly over the channel and they'd fly behind the guns. And what they did was they maintained standing patrols. So each one of these rings is a racetrack with 2 aircraft. And so as the V1s came over, they were detected by radar, and then the aircraft were vectored onto them. And you can see here we've got the Manston loop, we've got the New Church loop, and there would have been airfields here as well.
So our study of a licensed excavation study of a Hawker Tempest that we looked at began with some aerial photography. And I am telling you, in that photograph, there is the site of this crash. We spent hours studying this, and we could not find where it was. We had permission to do the excavation. We embarked on it, and we ended up down here because an eyewitness had said that they thought it was down here, and we were gradually losing hope. But there's a rather lovely story about this house.
Yeah, we happened to make contact with a woman who lived in that house during the war when this aircraft actually crashed. She wanted to go out into the cottage garden to pick gooseberries, but her mother said no, you have to brush your hair first. Whilst she was brushing her hair, the aircraft crashed, and it crashed right in the gooseberry patch. So of course, we looked at the garden, we looked at these row of bushes, and at the end here, there were no bushes. We had the site of the crash.
Sadly, Flight Sergeant Anthony Drew was killed. The aircraft came, it was flying in the pair that were on anti-diver patrol, flying bomb patrol. They lost sight of each other. He was seen by somebody on the ground trying to get out of his aircraft about 150 feet from the ground because there was cloud cover. The thing that we've never understood is that would have been 1/3 of a second. So he was trying to get out of his aircraft. He landed over there, not very far from where you are. His aircraft arrived here.
This is just a still from the excavation that we carried out. There's an air bottle there, various other bits and pieces. There was an awful lot of ammunition still laying about. We actually had to have the bomb disposal in to get rid of that. But again, this is a diagram of the excavation. They'd actually infilled the site with brick bubble, and in amongst that there were small bits and pieces of aircraft. In this layer, it was thick with aircraft wreckage and also household waste. And then down the bottom, we were into the clay, and this clay absolutely reeked of fuel. And right down the bottom, after they dug out the Napier Sabre engine, they chucked in all their empty ration cans, and they were all in the bottom of that hole, perfectly preserved.
This diagram proves the accident report at the time. We've done the calculations and we've worked out that Flight Sergeant Drew was actually falling from his aircraft at the point that people said they saw him. So it all comes true.
When we had a look at there's a series of records, they're called 1180s, so the aircraft accident record card. And on the back of that, it put forward various hypotheses for the cause of the crash. But as we were looking at the bits and pieces, it became evident to us that the pilot was confused, he was incapacitated, and we chanced upon this particular piece, which is the display for his remaining oxygen. Here is the valve where you can control the supply, and this told an interesting story.
Right, so we've coloured the needles. That's the critical factor. The device had received a really hard clonk to the back of it in the fraction of a second it took to go into the ground, and we think that's preserved the reading at the time. We've looked at it, we've studied it, we've talked to experts in the field, and that's the conclusion we've come to, but we've got other evidence that backs up the idea that the oxygen failed.
So, first thing, if you're bailing out of a tempest, first thing you do is you eject the canopy, and at the bottom of the hull we found lots of perspex and the canopy rails.
That's the gun camera counter that was fixed to the door to the side of the pilot that should have been jettisoned prior to bailout. That we found it in there means that he didn't use the standard method to get out of the aircraft.
This bit here is his RT jack plug. Normally what he would have done was unplugged that, and as he bailed out, that would have gone with him. It stayed in the aircraft.
And do you want to do the last thing?
Is that the remains of...
It's his helmet.
Oh, it's the remains of his flying helmet, which means that as he jumped out of the aircraft, his flying helmet was pulled off because it was attached to this jack plug. So he didn't follow the standard procedure for whatever reason. And the reason being is that he was incapacitated. The Tempest was a follow-on from the Typhoon. Had an inherent problem where carbon monoxide from the engine seeped back into the cockpit, and when they were flying it, they used oxygen at all times. And it looks very much as though his oxygen supply had failed through a leak, and he was confused. He probably opened his cockpit to get some fresh air. At the last moment, he realised his orientation, tried to get out, and the aircraft crashed.
Just very quickly, some other finds. This is very interesting here. Double magneto from the Napier Sabia engine, nicely conserved there. This is the front blind flying panel, the gun button control. This is the auxiliary feed for power at the top of the Napier Sabre. And do you want to cover that one, Sean?
Yeah, it's the butterfly throttle from the carburettor. One of the things that we do is we do a plot of where the bits and pieces that we find in an excavation have come from. And this is just a concentration diagram of all the bits and pieces we find from this particular aircraft. So you can see here there's a concentration of engine parts, cockpit parts, very little from the wings.
Right.
Right, so this brings us on to the V2. I've coloured this particular diagram so you can see the constituent parts. At the top end there was the warhead. Beneath it is an instrument section which had 4 sections, so it had a series of controls. The majority of the device is taken up with the alcohol tank and then the liquid oxygen tank. Takes you down to a turbine pump, and at the bottom end is the combustion chamber. And out of the back end here came the rocket exhaust, and it's shown here on its firing table with the lemon squeezer blast deflector.
In terms of archive research, bomb census report, they're held, if you're interested in researching flying bombs and rockets, they're held at Kew, the National Archives. So it gives details that were made, written down at the time that the impact had happened. This is dealing with Marden in Kent, where a V2 rocket exploded in a field that we're interested in. The thing that we were really interested in was it said fragments found were very small and those examined had no markings at all. Well, they're looking at the records as a whole. That sort of comment is quite frequent. Basically, there's nothing to be found. I've seen once somebody's written, presumably, all of the rockets just blown to smithereens. We've proved that that's not quite right.
Interesting point on here is that the average crater size for a V2 rocket was 40 feet diameter and 10 feet deep. But I'll qualify the depth by saying that was the apparent depth. And on the Marden one there, you saw the statistics. It was 37 feet across, and it was also 10 feet deep. That's 12 metres or 3 metres for those of you who use metric. Lovely aerial photograph taken in 1946 of the Marden V2. You can see the splash when the thing has detonated in the central crater.
Typically, on our first survey, we're finding bits like this. They are light and heavy gauged aluminium sheeting that have been twisted into shapes but annealed by the detonation. You couldn't bend those flat again. On the right hand side of the top slide, you can see parts of the turbo pump, which we will talk about in a moment.
Strange, although the thing was skinned with steel, you rarely find any remnants of steel. These are typical V2 impact site finds.
On the surface.
Bits of fuel tank. We did a series of surveys on this one. So we did a magnetometer survey, and we came up with, we did it at 2 different times of the year. We came up with the concentration here, these coloured dots.
Do you want to tell us what a magnetometer does?
Well, the magnetometer, it's a device which detects small anomalies in magnetism in the ground.
Deep, very deep.
Deep. We also discovered up here there was a set of readings. We discounted that because we then did a metal detector search of the field and plotted the blast pattern, and that gave us the confidence that the actual impact site was here rather than there.
So this is a different site, but the first scrape where you remove the topsoil after having identified with the technology where you think the thing is, first scrape, and we're right on it here. There is the infilled crater. Here's another one. This is actually Marden, another great tool. I'm sure many archaeologists would agree with you, but with us on this, is the drone. You can see it very clearly there. Lovely impact crater.
Of course, when V2s have gone in, they leave nice big holes. And the first thing that the landowner wants to do is fill them in. And of course, what do? Farmyard rubbish. The village, the town, whatever, it's also used as a rubbish dump. And here is an impact crater that we started to clear out, and there were absolutely piles upon pile of contemporary bits and pieces. That's the remains of an Anderson shelter. There was a military gas mask. There was pails, 105 litre drums, all sorts.
At the Marden site, the V2 rocket had gone through an orchard, and out of the hole came parts of the fruit trees, but this came from 4.5 metres down, part of the combustion chamber of the rocket, with a bit of the orchard still stuck into it.
This is typical V2 wreckage from depth. It's very agricultural. It's very heavyweight. These are joints. This is bits of combustion chamber. Very, very heavy. But of course it had to be, because it had to withstand the vibration, had to withstand the speed. It reached Mach 5 on the way up.
The flying bomb and the V2 rocket had something in common. Neither of them could get off their launch pads or the launch ramp without the help of some chemistry. The Germans realized that if you mixed sodium permanganate with hydrogen peroxide, you'd create lots of steam. So in terms of the V2, the steam powered the turbo pump that forced the fuel into the combustion chamber, and for the V1 flying bomb, it forced the paddle that stuck underneath the flying bomb, it forced it up the ramp and shot it off the end of the ramp. So here is that experiment to show you how much steam comes out of that chemical reaction.
These are very, very small amounts.
Yeah.
It's a violent exothermic reaction. Produces lots of heat, lots of steam. Now the V2 had a weight when it was fueled with the warhead on of around about 13 tonnes. The combustion chamber could only produce just over 10 tonnes of thrust. So at a weight of 13 tonnes, it was never going to get off the launch pad. But as soon as the turbo pump kicked in, then the combustion chamber could produce 25 tonnes of thrust.
So we're seeing ignition there.
Ignition, they actually shoved a Catherine wheel up into the rocket outlet and electrically ignited it. And this Catherine wheel spun round. They opened the taps, the liquid oxygen and the alcohol fed down by gravity, it ignited. Then the turbo pump was activated.
This slide. Okay.
And that produced enough thrust to get the thing off the launch pad. For the first 4 seconds of flight, it went vertically upwards. There was a timer circuit built in. After 4 seconds, the reference gyroscope was tilted, so I put it into this trajectory. And then after roughly 60 seconds, there was an integrating accelerometer in the nose, so it detected when it had reached its ideal velocity. That actually shut down the flow of fuel. And then, from about here onwards, it kept going, and it was a ballistic curve. It reached about, well, you can see here on the graph, 50 miles, and then from here, it was just free falling down to the target. So it reached Mach 5 on the way up, and then when it hit the target, it was probably going round about Mach 3.
There is some debate about what happens when it's up in space. Some people believe that because the weight of the rocket is in the rear end, it's that comes into the atmosphere first before the rocket realigning itself with its point coming down because of the friction with the air. That's a launch, and you can see what Sean's just told you about, where it aligns itself after 50 or so seconds.
Right, these are some large pieces sat inside. This is the turbo pump, weighed nearly half a tonne. It was a steam turbine. In the middle of it was the turbine. On one side was the alcohol pump, and on the other side was the liquid oxygen pump. So it's 2 pumps in one. Turbine in there, pump there, pump there.
And obviously the relevant finds are all from the same item. And that's from the centre of the turbo pump with the central shaft, central spline, before conservation, after conservation. You're not talking about a couple of days, by the way, to do that conservation.
Conservation can take months, if not years. Again, this is a spline from a turbo pump. This is the technical drawing. This particular one sits in the
National
Archives. Right, occasionally they broke up on re-entry, and this was a particular site we had a look at. On the contemporary photograph that we've got, you can see 3 distinct craters, and on this particular investigation we were fortunate enough to find a part that we hadn't found at other sites, and this is the graphite vein. This was actually laying on the surface of the field. It's made of the same sort of stuff that's inside a lead pencil, graphite. And what it did was it sat in the rocket exhaust and it moved to steer the rocket. There were also a set of air rudders at the end of the tail fins. But the reason it was made of graphite is because it wasn't eroded by the extreme heat from the combustion, which could reach something like 2,600 degrees centigrade.
And just to mention, go and have a look at the V2 rocket here at Duxford. That's a photograph I took of the rear end to show the graphite veins.
Normally, these are the sort of back-end finds that we see when the rocket's detonated. So you can see here we've got a locating pin, which is there just above the graphite vein. This bit is part of this annular ring that goes around the back end of the V2. That's a shoe for the graphite vein, but we rarely find anything at all of this because it's just blasted to smithereens.
Tell us about those two, Sean.
What's that?
The locking.
Oh, right. So the V2 rocket was of modular assembly, and the tail unit actually slid over. So the combustion chamber was put in place, and the permanganate tank and the peroxide tank, and then this whole tail unit was slid into place. And to make sure that it was slid on in the exact right position, there's a series of locators. You can see them there. Can you see them?
There's one on the right-hand side, just off the edge. I'm aware of time, so we're going to have to start shifting here. This is the oxygen, liquid oxygen, top-hot valve that would have been used just before launch.
Right, another tool in our toolbox is the use of LiDAR. LiDAR is topography mapping. Fortunately, the UK government has done an extensive survey of the UK as part of its flood prediction. And you can see here the contours of the countryside are displayed. You can download all of this information, but it comes in digital form. I've had to map it to bring it back to this sort of form. The point being here, you can see a V2 impact, which is hardly visible on aerial photographs, because that was a canal and it was covered over with reeds.
And because that V2 was an airburst, it burst in the air before it hit the ground, we found things that you wouldn't find in a proper impact. So we had dug very deep for this thing that had been picked up by the magnetometer. We thought perhaps there's a railway nearby and it's a bit of fencing. It turns out that it's actually the central structure of the control compartment that we spoke about earlier. So basically, the Germans would hang all of the electrical equipment onto plywood. So in between the angle iron, you've got strips of plywood.
To mitigate against air breakup, they realised that on re-entry there was excessive heat build-up, and the outer skin of the V2 rocket could reach something like 600 degrees centigrade. And they postulated that perhaps that excessive temperature was causing the half-empty or near-empty fuel tanks to pop So what they did was they wrapped it with glass fibre, which they held in place with chicken wire. This is a lovely piece of archaeology because you can see in the surface of the fuel tank the actual imprint of that chicken wire. It's interesting, when we look at the technical drawings, everything is in metric. But here, they describe this as 1 Zoll, which means 1 inch steel wire.
So our breakthrough excavation, this is the excavation we won an award for, we followed the contours of the original crater. And we found a typical shape where you've got sloping sides with an upside down top hat bottom. So this crater was recorded as 60 feet wide by 18 feet deep. We went down to 18 feet and we found a detonation layer. However, we didn't find enough of the missile. So after a lot of head scratching, a year or so later, we went back and we took all of the rubbish out again, and this time we went very deep, and it was the breakthrough. We found that what happens, because of the intense speed, 3.5 perhaps times the speed of sound, and the detonation, which was substantial, that pressure wave actually melts the chalk. This is clay on chalk. So basically, the chalk seals everything in and you can't see that anything's there. But critically, the top 5 feet of the missile, with an impact fuse, it goes into the ground. Because the detonation train is not supersonic, this is critical, it's not supersonic, it means that it can't keep up with the intense speed. It goes into the ground before it detonates. In London, if it hit a building, it would be devastating because it would detonate above ground. But in the Kent countryside, it goes into the ground, some distance, then detonates because of the speed.
That was the Achilles heel. If it hit something directly, it would cause immense destruction. But most of the blast was actually funneled upwards, whereas the V1, shallow impact, its blast was out sideways.
Contemporary photograph showing you the top hat affair. Here's our analysis of that particular site when we're trying to work out why we hadn't found what we'd found. There's the top hat. We found actually the bits and pieces were further down. And here's a model that I made to express that. There's the bottom of the top hat, so that's 18 feet. And I'm going to jump to metric because I can read this. 9.5 meters just here was the lowest point. And the blue represents the turbo pump. These represent the combustion chamber, and this is actually a compressed air bottle. The chalk, being a physicist friend of mine, would have it that at great depth, under great pressure, chalk exists as liquid. And the pressure wave created by the impacting V2 does the same thing. So on the left-hand side, you've got burner cups, which were arranged, 18 of them, were arranged at the top of the combustion chamber. Here they are, coated in what had been liquefied chalk.
A hell of a job to get that chalk off to conserve the pieces. Combustion chamber, the individual burner cups at the top, 18 of them. Oxygen went in middle here. This is part of the oxygen rose. And the alcohol, it had a double skin, so the alcohol was brought down to the base and then back up to cool the heat of combustion. And then it was injected into the burner cups through these little nozzles. Interestingly, these nozzles and some sites have been marked with a manufacturer's code. 3-letter secret armament codes, so that British intelligence could look at this and think, BMZ, what does that mean? Well, we've decoded these, and all of these were 3 different factories in the Czech Republic. This one here, again an armament code, that translates to a factory in Austria. And here is the Waffenamt code. So this is the inspection stamp to say that everything's okay. Little interesting point here. we hadn't realised that these codes were on individual punches, because somebody here has made an error. Here it's been applied as a U, and here it's been applied as an N. Of course, when we look up those manufacturing codes, one of them gives a totally incorrect factory.
Compressed air bottle. This is here to show you the before conservation and after conservation.
What they did was they overpressured the fuel tanks, so as the fuel was emptying out, to stop them collapsing and causing problems with instability. Again, from a report. This is the thing where the hydrogen peroxide and sodium permanganate are mixed together to produce the steam.
That's a recent excavation.
Again, part of the report writing. There's an interesting story here about how we got the compass bearing wrong. I don't think we've got time to go into that.
Just a very expensive analogue compass. We worked out the incoming trajectory just there and found, after we studied the drone photography, it wasn't right. It didn't match the shape of the crater. The reason the compass had been deflected was this great big electrical cable, set of cables on pylons going by the site. More analysis, excavation phases. You should be looking at just here this red dot, number 3. There was a very extraordinary detonation residue layer that we haven't quite explained yet. It was not equal on any of the 4 corners. That's a plan view. Looking from the side, the combustion chamber remains, which are just down here on the bottom right-hand slide. It was sitting on the layer. We took some samples of that layer for analysis with microscopy. But this funny, peculiar shape, we're trying to understand why it has happened like that. The red line is the section view, which is in the top right. There's
the deepest part we found in that particular dig. It remains of the combustion chamber. These are the little alcohol bleed nozzles to keep the combustion temperature down. Lovely picture of the bottom of the hole with the carbonised layer.
very difficult to dig in because it is horrible, wet, sticky clay.
Microscopy. Scanning electron microscope detected this, and the analysis showed it to be part of the glass fibre insulation.
Yeah.
This is the analysis, so silicon, oxygen, aluminium. We also took another sample here, what the scanning electron microscope showed. This is the spectral analysis. And again, what this roughly decodes that is manganese steel, aluminium, oxygen, and silicates remains of the glass fibre.
Right, now we're going to show you our analysis of the V1 and V2 offensive. I'm going to go straight into this. It took years of preparation and lots of archive reports.
Dates up here will increment, day at a time. These are V1s, so these little purple blobs are V1s. So you can see for each day, big circle, is the detonations for that day. And then I've just left a little blob that plots where the V1 landed. So we're going up towards the height of the campaign. So at the end of July, beginning of August, we literally had 100 plus per day coming over. They were launched here from fixed launch sites in the Pas de Calais. There's a series of plots here. And these were air launched. They were slung underneath Hyper 111s and air launched towards Southampton. It didn't actually hit Southampton.
Why do you think Southampton?
It was the preparations for D-Day. and the supplies across to the attacking forces.
First week of September, the authorities announced that they'd won the flying bomb battle, and we got the first V2 rockets.
So you can see the V2 impacts here, the red blobs on the blast. So there were 3 targets: London, Norwich, and there was just one launched against Ipswich.
But you can still see the flying bombs coming in. That's because they're being air launched from Heinkels off the east coast.
Again, targeting London.
And when we get to Christmas Eve, 1944, we find out just how indiscriminate and not accurate that method of launching was.
So just as a measure of the V2's accuracy, this cluster here were all targeted on Norwich, which is just there. Not one hit Norwich.
What you're looking at, we can discriminate down to street level. So you could focus on one part of London and see when the rockets or the flying bombs arrived. Christmas Eve coming up.
You can see how some of these,
There.
that was the Christmas Eve campaign. These were all targeting Manchester. So you can see one's as far up as, I can't remember where that was, further north. But you can see the spread. Again, there was only one within the confines of Manchester City. So, totally indiscriminate weapons. At this point of the campaign, it's pretty much V2s against London. You'll see coming up.
I'll tie us up quickly through the last slides.
V1 launched from the east. Again, the V1s are starting to come in now.
And where were the V2s launched from?
V2s were launched here from the Hook of Holland, majority from The Hague. And that's the end of the campaign. So the final days, they used up a fair number of V1s.
Right, we're running out of time, so I'm going to run through the last piece of our presentation fairly quickly. In terms of us, we were filmed for National Geographic, a documentary that you can still get online, Hitler's Killer Rocket. There we are. We had a great deal to do with this, which was the V2 impact, and discussing how the turbo pump arrives at the lowest point and the combustion chamber is further up in the section. BBC. Local schools, we broadcast from the sites live. So this particular school got live broadcasts right the way through the excavation. They went crazy for it, they loved it. A really wonderful collaboration with Australia. Very happy with these people, they've been very kind to us. They presented a live beam from one of our sites, this site, which is just by Rochester in Kent. Lovely section there shown. The team, which is growing all of the time. Alice here is studying archaeology at Durham. This is a team of digital surveyors. So the intention here is that we'll be able to do what I said at the beginning. We'd like to be able to see our analysis in 3 dimensions. We're getting very close to that. Taking part in conferences, magazine articles. Very good magazine, the Iron Cross magazine, a very academic magazine giving details of German military history. Project designs for excavations have to be submitted. Report writing after the event. Obviously, massive conservation. We've now got MDA coding, which means all of the artifacts have to be numbered so that we can actually pin them down to positions and sites. I carved a stone for a local village to commemorate 2 pilots and the people who lost their lives in the First World War. Great occasion. Commemoration of a flying bomb site. This lady here is the closest living relative to Flight Sergeant Drew, who lost his life in the Tempest. And the great achievement.
A walled garden alongside the crash site. The crash site's just over this wall. This is owned by the MOD, and it was the walled garden for a country house. So the MOD have a team of contractors that do their field work for them. So they trim trees and all the rest of it. Anyway, they've cleared this area. They've bought how many trees?
About 90, I think it is.
Is it 90?
So it's going to be Kentish old variety apple trees. It's the Flight Sergeant Drew Memorial Orchard. That's it, folks.
So you can follow our work on Twitter, Crater Locators, and you'll be up to date with the things that we're getting up to. We've got some interesting things planned for later on this year. We've got some work on flying bombs.
Yes.
And some work on aircraft.
I'd like to thank the RF Museum and Dr. Harry Raphael for inviting us here. And thank you very much for coming, the live audience, and to all of you listening around the world.
Fascinating to see some of the work you've done. For the online audience, hopefully you can hear me despite the microphone situation. That's very kind of you, Colin, to approach me now off camera. So you need to retake a position in a moment. For those online, if you use the ask a question function, and we'll put the questions to the room, I think I'll ask you, Colin, to repeat what they've said. And for those in the audience as well, we'll summarise the questions. But for those who have come along because of it, I think it's great as well that we've got some artefacts for you to look at. After the lecture, you want to go and see those. Can you put your masks on, please? Make sure you don't come this way, because we've got some loose cables. So, apart from that, if anyone has any questions in the room, don't be shy. See, you're all eager.
Whereabouts is the orchard that's been planted in Kent?
That's a place called Acres, Acrise, near Densole, near Hawkinge Airfield. What was Hawkinge Airfield in Kent?
So what was the total number of hits from the V1s and V2s?
Right.
You need to repeat the question.
Yes. So what was the total number of hits from V1s and V2s? I've had to write it down because there's lots and lots of statistics. But against the UK, there were a total of just over 9,000 launched, of which 5,800 reached land. And the V2, there was 1,400 launched against the UK, of which 1,050 reached land. The majority of the V2s landed in open countryside, but they did cause devastation when they hit targets. Overall, the V1 and V2 were also used against targets on the continent. So we're looking at perhaps over 20,000 V1s in total being launched. And the figure for V2s, 3,172.
But to put that into some sort of context, in 1944 and 1945, the Germans dropped nearly 10,000 tons of bombs, including V weapons, on this country. Now the thing is, a V1 and a V2 both had the same payload, 1 ton. Meanwhile, during the same period, we have dropped, the Allies have dropped 1.7 million tons. At that stage of the war, I think the game was up. The leader, Hitler, had put all of his faith in the new wonder weapons. That's where all of the money went, at the expense of the basic fighting tools, including fuel for fighters to attack the aircraft that we were sending to drop bombs on Germany.
In actual fact, it's more than likely that the only reason they kept going with the V weapon campaign is because these were part of the wonder weapons. and it was a way of keeping the population on board with what they were doing. So this is the last great hope of Germany. We're going to win the war with these wonder weapons.
Can you just tell us about the price of the two, by the way?
Well, yes. So in 1945 prices, a V1 would have cost round about £125, whereas the V2 was a highly complex piece of machinery, and that would have cost in the region of £12,000.
Extraordinary.
So the price differential to deliver the same payload was absolutely significant. And the V2, of course, was taking skilled German technicians in factories to produce these finely tolerant parts. Okay, we've got some questions that have come through on the internet.
Right. Are you able to answer this one about Wildhorn?
I'll read it out. Did Operation Wildhorn 3, which I think is bridge free in Polish, have any impact on stopping the V2 threat to Britain? So the chap says, my great uncle was on that special mission and he was awarded the DFM and the Polish Cross of Honour.
So, if I'm right, this is where a Dakota flew to collect the remains of a V2 rocket that had come down outside of Germany, Poland, wasn't it?
It was in Poland, yeah. They had a firing range. So Peenemünde was heavily bombed. They relocated their test firings to Poland. And the Polish resistance were very adept at gathering together bits and pieces of exploded weaponry. And one particular V2, there was a substantial remains that they pushed into a swamp before the Germans came looking for it. That was then collected. What it did was it helped the Allies understand how the device worked. But unfortunately, it didn't do anything to mitigate against the threat, because once the V2 had been launched, it was unstoppable. There was nothing you could do about it. So the effort was then putting into disrupting the supply chain. So it helped to understand what sort of supplies were going into making a V2 launch. So that was the oxygen, the alcohol, the permanganate, the peroxide, and then the transport of the various sections and the warhead. So that's why the Allies then concentrated on disrupting those supply routes. And the Allies only made one attack on the place that was putting these devices together at Nordhausen, and they didn't. That was a big underground factory, 22 kilometres of tunnels, and they didn't attack the tunnels. They attacked the town of Nordhausen. Unfortunately, that killed 4,000 residents of the town of Nordhausen and 1,500 prisoners who were being forced to work in the tunnels.
A truly remarkable story, Wildhorn. It doesn't really help that the film companies made a film about it but featured a V1 flying bomb. It's a truly remarkable point in the Second World War. You've got people in government who didn't believe that it was possible that the Germans could launch a rocket from the continent to hit London. That's because some of them were entrenched in an old-fashioned view that the fuels used had to be solid. So the Germans were not using solid fuels, it was liquid fuels. And the Wildhorn exercise proved that it was liquid fuels.
Okay, some questions that have come through on the internet. There's a question about bodies. Are these sites not war graves? We're very, very careful. We do research on each one of the sites to make sure that the incidents that we investigate haven't killed anybody. But when a V1 comes down, it leaves a blast crater, blows everything out. And the V2, the ones that we've looked at, have been in open countryside and haven't killed or injured anybody.
We're quite vigilant about that.
Yes. There's another question there about unexploded V1s and V2s. Again, we look at contemporary imagery, we look at the reports to make sure that what we're investigating has actually exploded. The V1 leaves a characteristic crater. The V2 also leaves a characteristic crater. If a V1 hadn't exploded, it would actually still be in bits on the surface. Some have been found there was an interesting incident. I think it was off the east coast, one of the ports there. A local fisherman reported that there was an object in the water that he used to tie his boat up to. Somebody identified it as part of a V2, and it ended up with a big recovery operation by the Ministry of Defence to make sure that this thing was safe. They thought it was unexploded, but of course it wasn't. It was one that had airburst, and the combustion chamber was sat in the water.
Have we got any questions in the room before we go online again? Yes, sir.
How are you guys funded to do your work?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. The question for those of you listening online is, how are we funded? Well, it's a big problem. Basically, we've been having to fund ourselves to do this. We really believe in what we're doing. A perfect opportunity, if you don't mind, Dr. Rafal. We are looking for funding. We've got a really magical idea about what to do with all our finds. We're going to create an online museum in a very particular way. But we need money to do this, because archaeology is not for a select few. I think it's got to be disseminated. Everybody's got to have access to it. And I particularly enjoy when people come up with new ideas that may be different to what I think about things. I want our information to be out there for everybody. So if anybody's got any ideas about funding, please get in contact. Any other questions? We're just checking online now.
So was the V1 tracked by radar?
V1 tracked by radar, yes. Lots of radar stations across the south coast. For example, the one that Flight Sergeant Drew was involved with was Ginfiz. They were given code names for obvious reasons. So the racetrack pattern that we showed earlier, they'd be flying around. Sometimes the pilots could see the incoming flying bombs because there'd be a curtain of black going up from the anti-aircraft, but they would have people firing mini rockets to show the flight path of the flying bomb for the pilots to follow. However, most of the contacts were achieved through radar.
At the back end of the V2 campaign, the V2s were also tracked by radar. So on the continent, they had radar, and they took plots. And what they were doing is they were trying to backplot to where the V2 had been launched. Some of those records still exist, and we were particularly interested in the first V2 that we dug at Sittingbourne. Why was it so far off course? We got hold of the radar plots, plotted on a map the positions that were recorded in 1945, and the thing was off course right from the moment that it was fired. And we came up with quite an interesting proposition, because we then looked at the times of firings of the ones in Kent. Why were they all so much off course? And we found out that a significant number of them were nighttime firings. One of the things that they had to do to get the thing to fly in the right direction was precisely align fin number 1 of the rocket with the target. And they had to make sure that the rocket was absolutely vertical. And they did this with surveying equipment, which was optical. And so you can imagine, on a dark night, a German soldier looking down through a little optical device.
Damp, foggy Hague, yeah.
Shining a torch and getting this parallax problem with what he was seeing. And so it was probably the fact that they were nighttime launches. Why were they nighttime launches? By this time, we had Spitfires marauding over Holland, the Hook of Holland, looking for rockets out on their launch positions, firing rockets, dropping bombs, strafing to try and disrupt the launchings.
Across the southeast of England, the whole of the ground was divided into mild squares. On the corner of each square, a microphone was placed, and the sound of the rocket going over was transferred to a listening station, or listening stations, with the central recording unit at the King's School in Canterbury, where that sound was transferred to photographic tape. That signal that it gave was back-plotted using miniature searchlights with a map on the wall to give the firing point.
real impact from the archaeological work that you're doing. In fact, in the RAF Museum's collection, we have a radar plot, and it really is for those here, like that. That's how quickly the radar they picked up on the launch site itself was really incredibly quick. So I think it's fantastic to see just how meaningful the work you're doing is in terms of historical interpretation. So, when you've got another question, haven't you, Colin? Check,
Sure.
do you want me to ask it?
It was to do with material requirements. Was this a limitation in the numbers built? Well, if I tell you the V2, from the moment it was conceived and they decided to put it into production after testing, between that point and the end of the war, they actually made 65,000 design changes to the device. So the point being, it hadn't been properly developed. There was still lots and lots of development that was being made to perfect the device. So the point being is that if it had been developed in the 1930s, I mean, it was being worked on, but if they'd got to the point of production, say in 1939, then we would have been in serious trouble. The accuracy and perhaps the payload would have increased significantly. But it's also interesting that both the V1 and the V2, they used a lot of proprietary bits and pieces as well as specially designed pieces. I mean, you see bits and pieces that you see from a German aircraft. But you know, these bits and pieces here, the injection nozzles, they were all specially made. And they were made of bronze. So yes, the V2, the V1, they were consuming materials that the industry in Germany could ill afford. It's also interesting that the V2 rocket, to launch one rocket, took 25 tons of potatoes. It's because the alcohol was manufactured through brewing potatoes, and it was 75% by alcohol, by volume alcohol, so it was drinkable alcohol. And so you can imagine that just to actually get the amount of alcohol that they needed to launch what they launched, how many tons of potato that actually deprived the German population of. And the drinking of the alcohol was such a problem that they actually had to put dye, and they had to denature the alcohol to try and dissuade the German soldiers from drinking it. But the German soldiers found out that if you actually got a couple of military gas masks and trickled it through, it would actually produce something that was still drinkable without any ill effects. But of course the Americans then used chemically manufactured alcohol, so they used ethanol, which of course if you drank that would either kill you or turn you blind.
The later V1 flying bombs, we're talking about 1945, towards the end they had plywood wings. You'd like to think that's because of a shortage of materials, but it's not. It's because all of the launch ramps have been overtaken by the Allies advancing through France, Belgium, Holland. The Germans tried to increase the range of the flying bomb by making it lighter. They increased the front of the flying bomb to allow for more fuel. So it's down to increasing the range and nothing else.
The Germans even ran short of explosives, and there are tales that the V2 warhead, they filled it with concrete, or they actually diluted the amatol with rock salt. It's interesting because when the Americans were testing the V2 at White Sands, they wired up the controls the wrong way round. So instead of flying in the direction they wanted it to the test range, it flew across the border to Mexico and caused an international incident. But the interesting thing was they didn't actually fly them with warheads. They actually filled the warhead compartment with sand. And this particular V2 came down in Mexico, and it blew a hole, that was 60 foot in diameter and 20 foot deep. So, you know, why did they bother to put explosive in it in the first place? Because the kinetic energy from hitting the ground at Mach 3 was enough to cause a lot of damage.
So do we have a question in the room? Yes.
So during the campaign, the weapons got more accurate, and does it make your work
So the question is, during the campaign, did the weapons get more accurate? Does it make it more difficult for us to find what we're looking for? In terms of the V1 flying bomb, Kent, where I live, my brother comes from Lancashire, Kent is the killing ground for the flying bomb from the anti-aircraft, the balloon barrage, and the pilots shooting them down. So there are lots of examples. We're still working our way through to try and get one essential theme to try and understand the dynamics of the offensive. The V2 rocket, we are relying on open countryside and basically misfires of some way.
Yeah, in terms of accuracy, there are stories that British intelligence misled the Germans in their reporting. But on our moving image, when you look at the day-to-day impacts, we can see no evidence whatsoever that the V1 or the V2 was disrupted in terms of where it impacted.
I mean,
having all the plots like that, I can actually look at the precision and the accuracy. So the precision, the mean point of impact, if you take the nominal target as being, say, Tower Bridge or the Houses of Parliament, the mean point of impact is actually 10 kilometres to the east and slightly north. So there was an inherent problem with the position that was targeted. They were off course. They were always too far to the east. But also the accuracy, they were hopelessly inaccurate. The accuracy was over 3 times greater than it needed. I mean, if you had a device that was very, very accurate, then all you'd do is every time you lobbed one over, it would just dig a deeper hole because they'd all land in the same position. So if you look at the, say, M25 as being the delimiter for the London area, you can calculate how big that area is. Well, the area that they actually landed in was 3 times greater than that, which just gives an idea of how inaccurate they were. But what I will say is that the V1 was very, very accurate when it was ramp launched. Very accurate.
We were under serious threat. We've come to the conclusion that that phase of the battle, it was the second Battle of Britain. I mean, dwarfed by D-Day and the attention that's got, but that battle against the V1 was completely critical to us. The other factor that I'd like to mention is that I've seen reports of 1 in 10 flying bombs having a trailed wireless receiver, basically, a transmitter. So the Germans were able to launch a ranging shot and they'd know where it had landed.
Yeah, it was only, I mean, Kent was never targeted. And it was just through the development of various devices. The proximity fused anti-aircraft shell was a big, big step forward. And using American radar vans and radar guided gun laying went a long, long way to improving the accuracy of the defences. And in the end, when you look at how many were fired and how many the defences brought down, over the UK it was 43%. But in the siege of Antwerp, then the anti-aircraft successes there and the other defences that would have put in place, the success rate was it was over 75%.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes, so probably time for one question in the room before we go back online, because there's a question there I want to end on. So, has anyone got a question in the room? Don't want to be walking back to Cosford Station thinking, I wish I'd asked that question. No? Well, okay, we've got a few online. Do you want to choose? Have you chosen one of those?
Let me have a look.
At the end of the day, V1s...
They can't hear you, Sean.
Okay. Online they can't. V1s, the anti-aircraft, because of the proximity fuse that was first put into operation in August, the anti-aircraft scored the most with 1,840. 1,878. Fighters brought down 1,847. The balloon barrage 232, which was just under 4,000 that the defences brought down.
Okay, so So there's a question here about whether there is an online resource to enable the public to find V weapon or other bomb landing sites.
That's very difficult. There are some online sites where people list where the flying bombs and the V2s came down, but the whole process, it's not just one thing. You have to go to many resources, use various techniques to actually discover where they are. I mean, the critical thing is the generation who remember these things are dying out right now, unfortunately. So we've all got a sense of duty to speak to those people and take down their stories, because it's our history.
Okay, so we've got a question which I want to end on, which is from Sandra. She asks, how can we donate to your brilliant work? I'm sure you'll be delighted to answer.
Direct message me. I'm more than delighted. That's my favourite question. You could direct message me on our @CraterLocator Twitter site, then I'll get in contact from that.
Okay, brilliant. If you want to post any links, we can do that in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so I think before I say thank you to our speakers, I do want to say thank you to Steve, who's at the back. And Steve, who's manfully dealt with the many issues we faced live streaming from Cosford today. So for those who are watching online, we've lost one of our microphones, and you can see I'm not wearing a microphone, all of which has been part of the challenge of presenting from an old lecture theatre in terms of its kit. He's dealt with it magnificently well, so many thanks. Thank you all who have come to Cosford today. We are back here in November and December with 2 more lectures, and we've got a lecture in Wolverhampton before then at the university, and in February we're at the university with a lecture with, it's an air power lecture, and his name's completely gone, even though he's probably the most famous person working in air power at the moment. I'll post that online once I've recalled it. But yes, you're all very welcome to come to those, including the ones in Wolverhampton. They're open to the public. They're all free. Our London lectures are free. They're all online on Crowdcast as well. And our conference from London will be live streamed, and it's £35 to watch the whole 2 days. So I think that's all that's left for me to say, other than thank you to those watching online and dealt with technical problems, is thank you very much to our speakers, Colin and Sean Welch.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
We do have a selection of artifacts.
That's it.
And you're welcome to come down and have a look at them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.